For everyone online, thank you for joining us as well. Welcome to Condon Street's Heritage Weekend, where today we have a guest speaker, Mr. Keith Stokes, that's going to help us learn more about Condon Street's history and our heritage from way back when and bring us up to date now. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to kick off with introducing Mr. Stokes here. I'll read his biography because some of us here in the sanctuary are familiar with him. He is a returning guest, but for those of you online, we want to make sure everyone's in the know. So our guest speaker, Mr. Keith Stokes, is presently Vice President with the 1696 Heritage Group. The 1696 Heritage Group is a historical consulting firm dedicated to helping persons and institutions of color to increase their knowledge and access to the light of the truth of their unique American heritage. The firm draws on extensive knowledge and experience in ethnic American historical research, interpretation, program, and product development. Mr. Stokes has a long and distinguished career in business and community development with degrees from Cornell University and the University of Chicago. His past professional positions have included Executive Director of the Rhode Island Economic Development Corporation and Executive Director of the Newport County Chamber of Commerce. He has also been an advisor for Rhode Island with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and served on numerous regional and national historic preservation boards, including chairman of the Toro Synagogue Foundation, vice president and trustee of the Preservation Society for Newport County, and Newport Historical Society. Mr. Stokes is a frequent national, state, and local lecturer in community and regional planning, historic preservation, and interpretation with an expertise in early African and Jewish news, legends, and Jewish American history. Mr. Stokes frequently appears on national historical programs including C-SPAN, Fox News, Legends and Lies, and TED Talks. Mr. Stokes has traveled to Ghana, Africa, to develop a lecture as part of the 400th anniversary of the transatlantic slave trade. Recently, he was the lead researcher and author of A Matter of Truth, report for the examination and documentation of the role of the City of Providence and the state of Rhode Island in supporting a separate and unequal existence for African heritage, indigenous, and people of color. He's been the recipient of numerous local, state, and national awards, including the United States Small Business Administration, Rhode Island Small Business Advocate of the Year Award, American Sail Training Association Leadership Award, Rhode Island Black Heritage Society's Frederick Williamson Award, Historic Preservation Award, Rhode Island Martin Luther King Keeper of the Dream Award, and along with his wife, is the recipient of the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities Prize for Creative Achievement in the Humanities. Lots of accreditation there. Makes me feel like I need to go back and continue my education. So thank you guys for joining us. And with that, I will kick it over to you, Keith.
Thank you very much, and I can't tell you what an honor it is for a Newporter to be here in Providence. My ancestors were part of the second founding black church in Rhode Island, the Union Color Congregational Church, which we've always seen as the sister church of Condon Street Baptist Church. I'm going to attempt to provide about 4 centuries of history in about 30 minutes, but most importantly, I will make sure that a copy of this presentation is made available to the church and the congregation for its members. Many of the items that you'll see have been digitized and now part of the collections of Rhode Island Historical Society, Newport Historical Society, and most importantly, Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. And one of the more exciting things that I'll be talking about after the presentation, my wife Teresa is here with the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. We have some very exciting news with partnerships with Rhode Island College and the state, where we're going to be launching curriculum in black history for all K-12 schools. And we'll be in the process of cataloging, preserving, and eventually digitizing, making available to the general public over 2,600 cubic feet of collections. Much of those collections tell the stories that I will tell today, very much anchored on the history of Condon Street Baptist Church. So I'm going to try my best to do 4 centuries in 30 minutes. I'll be covering lots of information, but I'll certainly be available to answer any questions, any and all questions you might have. Next slide, please. So I think the starting point for this discussion is to start by the early arrivals of Africans to the Americas, and particularly in Rhode Island. And over the last several years, I've been able to work with a number of historical organizations and scholars, and for the first time, we now have a very well-documented database that between 1705 and about 1805, that 100-year period, the time which we call the golden age of maritime heritage and history of Rhode Island, we now know that Rhode Island merchants were directly involved in underwriting, in sending, and profiting from at least 934 slave voyages. Out of those 934 slave voyages, 72%, or 672, came from Newport alone. But what's most important to recognize is that during the time of the American Revolution, in British North America, Rhode Island was at the center of the transatlantic slave trade, led by Newport and then later followed by Providence and Bristol. And one of the things that we've been able to do with this database is to identify not only who owned and operated the slave ships, but more importantly, where they landed in West Africa. And what today we recognize as the Gold Coast is Ghana. So one of the things that's been most exciting in our work is that we've now been able to reconstruct not only the transatlantic trade, but we've been able to reconstruct the very lives of those African men, women, and children that survived the Middle Passage, that eventually would arrive in Providence and become the early builders of the earliest African religious, civic, social, and educational institutions. Next slide, please. Yep. Next slide, please. And one of the things in doing and understanding this is the fact that these Africans that arrived here in Providence in a very special circumstance. In fact, many of the popular discussions that we hear today talk about the slave trade in Providence tied to the Brown family, when in fact they're not even the most active slave traders. The most active slave traders are the Nightingale family, the Sterry family, certainly the Wolfs, who are operating out of Bristol and Providence. But what's more important is that Providence participation in the transatlantic trade is not a transatlantic participation. There are some Providence ships that are traveling from Providence to West Africa, and from West Africa to the West Indies, or the West Indies back to Providence, that triangular trade. But that's really more of a Newport transit system. Providence really gets active and engaged in the trade after the American Revolution, after it's outlawed by the now state of Rhode Island, and it's outlawed by the new United States. And it is Providence and Bristol merchants between about 1777 all the way into the early 19th century are largely sending slave ships not to West Africa, but to the West Indies, and particularly to Cuba and Puerto Rico. And there, enslaved Africans are taken from the West Indies, and then Rhode Island ships, largely Providence and Bristol, are transporting them directly to places like Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. So it's this inter-American trade that the Providence merchants become quite adept at. But what's most important to recognize is that we now have documents of the ships, of the African men, women, and many children who would survive and eventually arrive here. And then most importantly, the next slide, we now are able to assemble and organize the very lives of the Africans themselves. And one of the things that I want to emphasize, because I really speak less and less about slave traders and slave trade, and I'm really less interested in John Brown or James the Wolf or slave owners and slave traders. I'm more interested in the African men, women, and children that survived and ultimately thrived and would become the contributing builders of our African institutions such as Coggan Street Baptist Church. So one of the things that I've been able to do in working with scholars across the African diaspora, I've had the honor to actually physically see primary documents of Africans who eventually would arrive to Rhode Island in Jamaica, in Barbados, in Curacao, in the Dominican Republic, and back to Ghana. And one of the things that I is that we are established as a Rhode Island colony, as an English colony. We're not Spanish or Dutch or Portuguese. So for the most part, our traders, both slave trading and general product trading, are trading with other English settlements. So if it's in the West Indies, it's not Cuba, it's not Puerto Rico early. The early trading is in Barbados and Jamaica. And when it's across the African West Coast, places called the Grain Coast or the Guinea Coast or the Gold Coast, we're finding that most of the Africans that were taken by Rhode Island, and particularly Providence ships to the West Indies and some eventually to Rhode Island, originated in what is today Ghana. And one of the things that we found is, and I've had the extraordinary experience to actually physically visit the slave castles in Ghana, particularly Cape Coast Castle, but most importantly, Fort William at Ananabo. Ananabo is today recognized as the most active English slave fortresses during the transatlantic trade, and it is the center of trade and activity for Rhode Island merchants. There are reams of primary documents, ship logs, diaries, estate records that talk about Rhode Island merchants and captains by name landing at Fort William at Ananabo. Today, Fort William at Ananabo mostly represents the Ashanti and Fanti people of Ghana. In fact, the Fanti people, the coastal people, were managing the fort. And one of the most extraordinary discoveries for me was the fact that as Rhode Island merchants were landing on the African coast, and as they were negotiating the capture of enslaved Africans, they were negotiating directly with Fanti leaders. In fact, the Rhode Island merchants call it the black trade. They are physically negotiating the capture and transport of enslaved Africans from West Africa along what is called the Middle Passage and landing in the West Indies and places like Barbados and Jamaica. They're trading with, they're negotiating with not white slave merchants, but African tribal leaders, particularly Fanti leaders. And the Fanti leaders would engage Ashanti warriors to capture further inland, raid villages, capture African men, women, and children, march them inland to the coast, place them in these horrid slave castles and dungeons for months and months, and then when the round ships would arrive, these Fanti canoemen would canoe out to the ships with the captured human property, and they'd be placed on ships, never to return. So I just want to explain, as we research and discover and understand this history, you can't see history as black and white. It's more shades of gray. The complicity of the transatlantic slave trade that eventually would transfer at least 12 million African men, women, and children from Old World to New World was a complicit participation across racial, ethnic, religious lines. And in Rhode Island's case, everyone participated at some level, everyone benefited from some level. What ties it together is that nearly all of those Africans that would arrive here had an Ashanti, Fanti, or what is today a Ghanaian connection. And one of the more interesting aspects of that connection is many of the Ashanti people of that time have a tradition which exists to this day, and it's a tradition called day naming. So if a child is born, the day of the week or the birth order, they're giving a specific name. So if you're a boy that happens to be born on Sunday, your name is Kwasi or Quash, the anglicized pronunciation of that. If you're a boy that's born on Friday, it's Kofi, K-O-F-I. The former Secretary General of the United Nations was Kofi Amin. We anglicize that, or phonetically we spell that and we pronounce it as Cuffy or Cuff. There are tens and thousands of Cuffs and Quashis and Quams and Ajoba and all these day names across New England, across the West Indies, particularly in Barbados and Jamaica. Anywhere these Africans landed, these day names are either maintained or later, after enslavement, were retained. In fact, in Newport, we have the largest and oldest existing African burying ground, and many of the markers have these day names, and even have information as far as where they originated from, Cape Coast. So what's important for us to recognize is that even though our African ancestors arrived in the worst circumstance, chattel property, surviving the transatlantic trade, surviving the Middle Passage, and eventually arriving in the worst conditions, they were still able to keep remnants of their African culture and tradition. And I just want to emphasize why I'm talking about this, because it's important. For most other Africans who are arriving in the Americas, they were arriving from many different African countries, different tribes, different languages, different political systems, religious systems. But here, it's very much a holistic and very much a Ghanaian, Ashanti, Fanti influenced system. So many of the Africans, when they arrived here, many had political, religious, social relationships in Africa that they carried forward here. Many shared a common language, a common religion. In fact, by the 1750s, Africans in Providence, Newport, Warwick, Rhode Island, and then later we see it in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, every June would come together and select an African tribal leader, following the Yam Festival traditions that still exist to this day in Ghana. The white community interpreted that as a mimicking of white elections, and they called it Negro Election Day or Negro Governor Day. But now, in working with African scholars, They're saying no, they're carrying forward very important tribal traditions from the old world to the new world, and they're expressing it consistently and almost simultaneously wherever there are Africans across New England at that time. And again, these were happening in the 1740s and 50s, and they continue well into the early 19th century. So I just want to emphasize the fact that our ancestors survived possibly one of the most horrific circumstances in world history, but they more than just physically survived, they kept and maintained their African identity, their culture, their religion, their traditions, and all those things would give them an opportunity to become the builders of some of the earliest African institutions that would lead to this very place, this very historic place that we are here today. Next slide. So I want to talk now about freedom, because for many of us, when we talk about emancipation and the end of slavery in America, we almost immediately think of the end of the Civil War, we think of Abraham Lincoln, we think of the Emancipation Proclamation. But in fact, the very first emancipation effort, the most important effort, is after the American Revolution, starting in 1777 with the state of Vermont, and then followed by New England states and other northern states. By the end of the 1790s, nearly every New England northern state of its time that existed either gradually or directly emancipated enslaved African heritage people. So by the end of the 18th century, you have a new being in America, a free African in America. And we're talking about tens of thousands of people, largely clustered in urban centers. Because again, here in New England, in the Northeast, we don't have great weather, we don't have great soil, so we don't have really agricultural-based economies. This is not the rice plantations of the Carolinas or the sugar plantations of the West Indies. It's not tobacco fields of the Virginias. So for the most part, most of our Africans were living, working, eventually worshiping in urban seaports. That's why you see the early Africans clustered in Newport, Providence, Bristol, and then later you see them clustering in Boston. Even in Connecticut, they're largely in what is today Bridgeport, New Haven, in New York City, and Philadelphia. So they're clustering in the urban areas because that's where the work was, that's where the populations were. And by the end of the 18th century, each of these urban communities have very large and very organized free African communities. And there's another important aspect. If you were enslaved as an African in New England, you had as much a chance to be trained in the trades versus being a labor in a large plantation, because we didn't have a plantation economy. We didn't need hundreds of thousands of people to work large agriculture-based plantations because we didn't have that. What we would have is smaller farms in Narragansett County, which later became Washington County, today South County. We had Africans in Smithfield and Little Compton and Portsmouth, but they're working in smaller groups and smaller farms. They're in animal husbandry, they're raising goat, sheep, horses, raising corn, potatoes. But the larger number of Africans are in the urban cities. And in urban cities, you don't need agricultural-based workers, you need tradesmen and tradeswomen. So we have reams of primary documents where we find Africans, men, they are silversmiths, they're furniture makers. My own ancestor, whose family survived Ananabo to Jamaica, was brought to America at the age of 8 and then trained as a Windsor chairmaker, because that was the demand for that time. So having access to trade skills gave you access to education, gave you access to trade, and then for those now free Africans in largely New England, they had access of education, training, and knowledge and value that would be unheard of and unlawful if you happened to be an African that was enslaved in the American South or the West Indies. In fact, there's an old slave saying called "sold down the river." And what "sold down the river" means, better to be enslaved in a New England household as a servant versus being on a Virginia tobacco plantation, which was still better than being with the malaria, the mosquitoes, and the snakes in a Carolina rice plantation, and nobody wanted to be in a sugar plantation in the West Indies. And for those Africans that dared to resist, they were threatened by being sold south. The further south, the worse your circumstance. So I just want to be clear, because this is an important point. This first emancipation provided the first free African heritage people in America, largely clustered in New England, but they're free with access to education, they're free with access to trade, and they're also maintaining and now reclaiming their African identities. This is a very unique circumstance, and would create a very unique opportunity to build early black institutions. Not in Richmond, Virginia, not in New Orleans, not in New York City, but places like right here in College Hill in Providence, Rhode Island. Next slide. So who were these free Africans? Well, we're very excited because working with our historical institutions, and particularly the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, we're now able to piece together who they were, where they lived, and eventually when they would build their place of worship. We know by the 1790 census, there's at least 475 people of color living, mostly free, some still enslaved, in what is the College Hill area, usually east or west of what is today College Street. We also know that by the end of the 18th century, they're also now living, next slide please, around the Great Salt Marsh area. The Great Salt Marsh area today is recognized as the southern lawn of the State House, the train station, down to Canal Street, but that was a large Great Salt Marsh. Many of the free African heritage people, and I just got to stop here. You notice I'm using the term African heritage, not African American, not black. They were African. They were not colored, they were not Negro, they were not black, they were African. That's how they called themselves, that's how they named their institutions. They saw themselves as African. Many of them, of the older generation, were African born. And many of the second and third generation had passed on to them, through their African-born ancestors, a very strong sense of their African identity. So today, in 2021, I honor them, and I present what I believe is a more accurate historical depiction by using the term African heritage. And that's something that's been very important to me, but also something that, again, gives me an opportunity to recognize the very important identity of our early ancestors and founders. And what we now know is that there are hundreds of free African heritage men and women, heads of households. What you see in the slide here are actual heads of household families. You'll see some of the day names in there that are living, working, and eventually worshiping in early Providence, largely clustered around the Great Salt Marsh and largely clustered around the very early beginnings of South and North Main Street, Water Street, Benevolent Street, College Hill. We also know, and you can see the names that are highlighted here, these men become very important because by the end of the 18th century, they begin to organize an early African institution. Next slide, please. And these early free Africans immediately organize, and they take freedom as something that they're going to immediately build an African community in America. And in fact, their first institutions are called African lodges, African churches, African schools. It is African. And these Africans are organizing simultaneously and communicating simultaneously between Providence, Boston, Philadelphia, and Newport. And in fact, each and every one of these communities have one thing in common, besides having vibrant free African communities. They're seaports. And being seaports, ships of all kinds are coming in and out each and every day. The sea was the internet of the 18th century. If you needed information, you waited for a ship to arrive, and the mariners, the sailors would bring information as far as where they were, where they lived, what they saw, and 20% of the mariners of early New England, particularly in Rhode Island, are African indigenous heritage people. So it could be whaling ships, it could be the China trade, it could be coastal ships, even slave ships. At least 20% of the crew are African heritage indigenous people. So as these men were sailing off to different ports, they would come back to Providence and say, I was just in Philadelphia, and boy, what they're doing in Philadelphia, and where I stayed and lived, and the people I talk with, do you know that they're forming their own African church there? I was just in Baltimore, and they're doing some interesting things in Baltimore. I was in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and their community is called Little Liberia. So the sea becomes a very important connection in creating this African network that's all centered around places like Providence, Rhode Island. Next slide. And on a very important date, a date that I would love to have a holiday in Newport, may not get it, but someday maybe, November 10th, 1780, a group of African men, largely men who were African born, come together in the home of Abraham Casey, who's a chocolate grinder, a master chocolate grinder. His home doesn't stand anymore, but today it would be at the corner of Memorial Boulevard and Thames Street, right in the heart of Newport. And these men came together and formed, for the first time in world history, the Free African Union Society. How do we know this? Because the original records and meeting records and diaries are in the collections of the Newport and Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. And this African Union Society was set up to do three very important things. One, they took a census of everything that was African in the community. Life and death, where people worked, what churches they were worshiping in, how many children they have, did they have access to education. It's literally a census of demographic information. The second thing this African group in Newport would do is, using the sea, they would reach out to fellow Africans in Philadelphia, Boston, and Providence, suggesting that they too should form a Free African Union Society. Next slide, please. And over the next 10 years, between 1780 and 1790, each of those four communities would form their own African Union societies. In Newport, the African Union Society is corresponding in Boston with men such as names as Prince Hall, and encouraged them to form their African society. In Philadelphia, the Newport men are corresponding with two men, particularly a Reverend Absalom Jones and Reverend Richard Allen, who would form their African Meeting Society. And in Providence, they're corresponding with African men such as James McKechnie, Cuff Simmons, Bristol Yama, and others. And each and every one of these men, as they agreed to form these African Union societies, over the next several decades, these societies would evolve into the earliest free African heritage churches. The African Society of Providence, which I'll talk about in detail, would evolve into the Cogden Street Baptist Church. The African Society in Newport, my ancestors, would evolve into the Union Colored Congregational Church. The African societies in Boston would form an African meeting house on Joy Street, which still stands, and then later would evolve into a Baptist church. And in Philadelphia, the African societies evolved into the first African Methodist Episcopal Church led by Richard Allen, Mother Bethel, and the first African Episcopal Church at St. Thomas by Absalom Johns. I have ancestors that are members of each of those congregations. I mean, how cool is that? And what's most exciting for me, being a history nerd, they're corresponding, exchanging notes. The Newport men send money to Newport to help build the Mother Bethel AME Church. Prince Hall is contacting Newport and Providence men and suggesting, by the way, I want to build a Masonic order, and I think you should follow suit. And when Prince Hall establishes his Masonic order under his name and his affiliation as the African Lodge, the second African Lodge is established in Providence, the third in Philadelphia, and then eventually Newport. So when we talk about the founding African institutions of America, the very earliest Masonic orders, religious organizations, civic organizations, it's right here. It's not in Mississippi. It's not in South Carolina. It's not even in New York. It's right here in Providence, this sacred ground, and it's information that we don't know and need to celebrate. Next slide, please. And I just want to point out that this African identity is an important understanding, because as early as the 1790s, they formed their African society. They're exchanging information through the sea and the internet, through Boston and Philadelphia and Newport. And it's the Newport Africans who are saying, you know what, I want to go back to Africa. I don't think this is the right place for me. I know I'm free, but I'm still a bit of a second-class citizen, and I really think we should go back to Africa. So by the 1780s and 90s, Newport and Providence Africans in the two societies are talking actively about how do we raise money and consciousness to return to Africa. The Providence group reaches out to Moses Brown, who I'll talk about a little bit later, very important person with this congregation, and the Newport group reaches out to Reverend Samuel Hopkins, who is the pastor of the First Congregational Church and a very important supporter of the African Society in Newport. Our family actually owns his installation sermon from 1780. Samuel Hopkins today is recognized as the first abolitionist in America. Samuel Hopkins and Moses Brown are working in hand to abolish slavery and to literally uplift free Africans in Providence and Newport. These two men are two of the most important early humanitarians in American history and don't get the recognition that they deserve and that they've earned. But in any case, the Providence Africans decide that they will physically send someone to Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is now being occupied as an English settlement in West Africa, and the English are sending free Africans to Sierra Leone. And the decision is made that we as a Providence community would like to see if we can have a new settlement in Sierra Leone and return to Africa. And Moses Brown underwrites James McKechnie, who's one of the founders of the African Society. He's a blacksmith by trade. His wife's a dressmaker. They're living right on what is today South Main Street. And he actually physically travels to Sierra Leone, and he actually negotiates the free passage of several dozen Providence families. It never comes to fruition because when he returns, Samuel Hopkins in Newport is upset because they have not had a meeting house. He doesn't feel they're religious enough. He doesn't believe they will carry the Christian gospel, and he turns them down. So there is no time when a Providence group ever returns to Africa. There's a Newport group that returns by the 1820s, but they themselves were active members and tested as a part of the Christian church. So what's important here is not that they succeeded in returning to Africa, but the fact that they were thinking about that and acting towards that. They had a strong African connection identity. And again, this was happening in the 1790s. We just got out of the American Revolution. We're 60 years before the ending of the Civil War, and here are African heritage people thinking about and acting upon an African identity. Next slide, please. So let's talk about these Africans and their religion, because we know a little bit about their freedom, we know about their civic organizations, they're forming meeting houses and opportunities, but we also know that one of the unique aspects, not better or worse, but a unique aspect of Africans that are enslaved here in New England is that they're not only having access to trade skills and languages, they're also having access to religion. By the mid-18th century, there's a movement in the Protestant Christian church called the Great Awakening. And the Great Awakening is equivalent to an evangelical movement of today, but the difference was that the Great Awakening required that your belief in Christ and your access to God through Christ wasn't just simply going to a meeting house or a church or reciting the Bible. It was your physical, actual deeds. And many of the Protestant clergy at that time, through their really focus on this Great Awakening movement, was to begin to actively court and convert enslaved Africans into their places of worship. In fact, by the mid-18th century, it becomes this wholesale. There are diaries written by members of the clergy in Newport, Providence, Narragansett at that time, and they've got dozens and dozens of Africans every other week, it seems, that they're converting and they're baptizing. It's almost a competition. In Newport, Reverend Hunneman of my church, Trinity Episcopal Church, he writes in his 1743 diary, we have 300 Negroes a part of the parish. So what's important to recognize is that Africans now have, enslaved and free, now have access to religious services, which would have been unheard of and unnecessary and unlawful in the American South and West Indies. Because access to religion and education gives you access to cognitive skills in thinking. And at some point you might think, I don't want to be a slave anymore. There's going to be an uprising. Here, you didn't have the numbers, and you also had this interdependent living where people were living, working, worshiping on top of each other all the time. Not integrated, interdependent, two very important differences. So Africans in Providence now have full access, particularly to the First Baptist Church. It's hard to see this slide, but this is a part of the collection of the Black Heritage Society. We have an inventory of every African member of the First Baptist Church before and immediately after the American Revolution. Now, what's interesting is at that time, they're part of the First Baptist Church. Today, recognized the building was completed by 1775. As you know, the congregation is the First Baptist congregation in America, Roger Williams' vision. But it's important to recognize that for Africans who were members of the First Baptist Church or any white church at that time were in second-class living. They sat in the gallery in the back. They sat in what we call as old Newporters the nursing pews, where women with children would sit all the way in the back so you wouldn't disturb the sermon. Or they were up in the galleries or the choir lofts. They were away from service. And very rarely would they have access to communion or participating at any level. They were second-class worshipers. And that was the existence. And in fact, William J. Brown, born in Providence, would write an extraordinary autobiography, one of the first and most comprehensive autobiographies written by an African heritage person, and describes life in Providence, all during the antebellum and post-Civil War era. And he talks about being a member of the First Baptist Church and having to climb these stairs to the back of the gallery and barely able as a child to see the service and get any value of the service, and hearing from his parents and friends and neighbors saying, this isn't good enough for us. If we've converted, we believe in Christ, we believe in God, we should have every right to interact every Sunday or any time and express that free worship. I mean, think about this for a second. What is Rhode Island most recognized for? We're founded under religious freedom. We are the one colony that accepts and allows anyone and everyone, regardless of the religious faith, to become eventually a free citizen. That's important stuff. That's heady stuff. But if you were African, enslaved, and free, your freedom of religion was based upon second-class participation. And this was going on well after the American Revolution, and particularly here in Providence. Next slide. So because of that interest, a group of African men left the First Baptist Church, and on March 19th, 1819, they began a process of forming and organizing their own places of worship. And one of the things that we now have in the records of the Black Heritage Societies is the actual names of these African heritage men. We know their names, we know their trade skills, we know generally where they lived, but most importantly, we know their passion. And they come before Moses Brown, the great abolitionist of Providence, and they say to Moses Brown, the time has come for our own meeting house and our own place of worship. The time for second-class citizenship and worship is over. And Moses Brown stepped forward and gifted to them land to construct that meeting house, but under the very important qualifier from Moses Brown. Moses Brown was this sometimes Quaker, but really non-denominational, and he felt so strongly that so that we're not carrying over the white prejudice of pew ownership and church recognition and denomination, and being a Baptist or an Anglican is better than being a Seventh-day Baptist or a Calvinist. He absolutely required that I will fund the building of this meeting house, but it has to be non-denominational. You will accept and welcome any African of any denomination or no denomination, so they have a safe place to worship or a safe place to be. And on August 21st, 1821, you all know this better than I, that meeting house and schoolhouse is completed to one of the most significant public events in Providence at that time. Hundreds and hundreds of Africans organize and marshal a parade from the Hill down to Market Square. They're led by one of the earliest African militia groups, the African Greys, an all-African heritage militia group, and they're wearing plumage. They're carrying very much African-related staffs and symbols, and as they march around, it's an interesting story. They asked the Quaker community, who was very supportive, would you join us in the parade? And the Quakers went, oh, that's too ceremonial, that's too public, we can't do that. We're here to support you, but we can't march and dress up like that. But what's most remarkable is that the African community are celebrating publicly, triumphantly, and boldly, this is our place, this is our permanency in our community of Providence as free Africans, and this is in 1821. You know the story better than I, that African meeting and schoolhouse would eventually evolve in what is today the Cogniz Street Baptist Church. But I go back to what I'd said a few minutes before. Each and every one of these early African societies, who were all comparing notes and interacting amongst each other, would go on to form their own free African heritage churches. So when we talk about the history, the strength, the power of the black church in America, we're standing in it. We stand on the shoulders of our ancestors who survived the Middle Passage, who survived slavery, who survived race riots, and we're able to build this congregation, sustain this congregation, and you're still a part of it. I mean, how special is that? How cool is that, that each and every one of you are still a part of this sacred, historic place? There are very few people in America that have this type of day-to-day access and opportunity. It's yours. Next slide. And as these Africans build their meeting house, they're advancing freedom further by establishing a school. It's an early, in fact, it's the Newport Africans that form the first free private black school in 1808, and then followed by Boston, then followed by Newport. And again, why? Because we have the records. One of the cool things in Newport, we actually have the children's names and the teachers of those first schools. And then many of them would live to adult life, and many of them are buried in Godswill Lake or in our burying ground in Newport. So we have an entire life of children who were educated as the first free African children educated in their own school, which was owned by, operated by, and taught by fellow African heritage people. And the beginnings of these schools, again, are not Cincinnati, they're not Chicago, they're not Columbia, South Carolina. It's Providence, Boston, and Newport. Next slide, please. And I just want to emphasize that there were still challenges. Even though by the early 19th century, by the 1830s and 40s, we have our own African meeting house, we have our own school, we're all living as tradesmen in relatively working class or middle class. That's a hard description for the 19th century, but working class, meaning they were working enough in trade skills to keep themselves alive and own property or live in quality rental property. And they're living in areas around, as the Great Salt Marsh is shrinking because land is being filled and land is being demanded, we see the African heritage community living in what later have names as Squaw Hollow or Hardscrabble or Snowtown. These areas begin to be on the South Lawn and the train station, and then move to Canal Street, and then over to where the Providence Marriott is, and then later after race riots, they move up Only Street, which is Only Lane, and then up into University Heights and what becomes Lippet Hill, and then Mount Hope. And then later, you have Africans living in the Fox Point area, particularly those who are mariners. So for the most part, we now know, and we have some incredible records that we're working with the Black Heritage Society, we're able to take GIS maps and replot where these early African heritage people lived, worked, and clearly worshiped in early Providence. And it's quite exciting for me, again, being a nerd, because when you look at the earliest African settlements in New England, it's College Hill, Providence, Beacon Hill on the North Slope in Boston, Historic Hill in Newport. I mean, think about this. Today, these are some of the wealthiest enclaves in America, and people like us can't even walk the streets sometimes. Not that I'm buying a home or living in that area, but it's just fascinating to me as a historian that when we talk about today, the most desirable places to live, based on history, based on wealth, it was our communities. We built them. We lived there. We worshiped there. Those were our neighborhoods and our communities. And maybe there's a chance, an opportunity for us to take some of that back and give that to our children so they can exist in the communities that their ancestors built. So I digressed on that. But what's most important is that the African heritage community of Providence, they were settled, they were organized, but still fighting racial unrest, where slavery is now evolved into racial discrimination. As many of you know, or you should know, there are two significant race riots that are embodied within the Providence African heritage community. Initially Hardscrabble, and then later Snowtown. But it's important to recognize these race riots were going on simultaneously in Philadelphia, in New York, in Boston, in Baltimore, everywhere where the only African enclave where there's no documented race riot is Newport. And you'll have to come to another lecture in Newport and we'll talk about why that is. But what's most important is I don't want anyone to think that the racialized riots of Hardscrabble and Snowtown were simply based upon racism. Drunken sailors or Irish or other ethnic immigrants coming into black communities and tearing homes down. No, it was organized. The larger community, the organized governments wanted to dismantle these black communities for two reasons. One, these free Africans were competing for jobs. These free Africans were occupying spaces and buildings and locations that had to be moved and made way for the newly arriving immigrants who would work in their textile factories and on their waterfronts. So it's absolutely important that you understand these racialized riots were systematic removal of free Africans from communities and structures and industries were now highly valued by a fast-growing white community. In the 1970s and 60s, we called that urban renewal. Didn't that same thing happen to Fox Point, Upper South Providence, West Elmwood, Lippet Hill? So it's important for you to recognize that sometimes it's easy for us to look back at history and say it was race. He was a racist. They were a Klan member. They were an evil person. Well, no. It was an evil system and an evil structure that just simply evolved from slavery to discrimination to the challenge that we still see to this very day for people of color who simply want to live or work or worship in their own communities. And we see that playing out in the early 19th century of the early African heritage community right here in Providence. And in fact, one of the most insidious challenges that we found at that time is that by the 1820s, and it accelerates in Providence, if you were a single African heritage woman, and many were widows. I mean, you're working on a sailing ship, that's a very dangerous trade. And life expectancy was shorter at that time. So there were large numbers of widows generally, but there were particularly a large number of African heritage and indigenous women widows with children. And by the 1830s and 40s, Providence was setting policies where they saw these women and their children as non-citizens, as burden on society. This is before we had social welfare systems. Not that the social welfare systems we have today are perfect, but at least there's a system. So back then, towns determined that if anyone was to receive alms assistance or support assistance, they first have to be determined to be a citizen. And the Providence Town Council would actually have hearings and bring people before them and determine if they were a citizen or not. If you were a citizen, you could remain in town and you could receive support. If you were deemed not a citizen, they threw you out, you were ordered out, you were warned out, and you were returned to where you should be. These warning out hearings, if you ever have a chance, go to the Providence City Archives. There are reams and reams of hearings, and at least 50% of the hearings are women of color. So women of color are consistently coming to Providence and being displaced. If you look at the records of hardscrabble only in certainly Snowtown neighborhoods, and you have a listing here of hardscrabble neighborhoods, many of the homes are occupied by women. So it's important to recognize some of the earliest racialization of criminal behavior based upon race and sex is happening right here, and it's being placed upon African heritage people right here within Providence, and it becomes a challenge. And the next slide, please. Forces the Africans in Providence to become further organized. The African Meeting House becomes the center of not only religious and moral activity, but political activity, educational activity, civic activity, and they're meeting. They're meeting in the meeting house and discussing what do we do, how can we preserve the rights, and how can we just protect the very lives of our African women and children. So they begin to organize. And then eventually, by the end of the Civil War, they would win back through the Dorr Rebellion their right to vote. The African Greys would organize and support the state of Rhode Island against Thomas Dorr and the People's Convention, because the People's Convention rejected Africans. But because they fought on the side of the state, they were awarded in the 1842 Constitution the right to vote. And then later, when their private African schools did not receive the same tax-paying money and benefits and support as the new public schools, which were white only. Did you know that? Did you know public schools in Rhode Island were segregated until 1866? Public education is established by the 1820s and 30s, and there were public schools operating in Providence, Bristol, and Newport. But if you were African heritage, you could not participate in that school. You were still in a segregated school. And it took the African communities of Newport and Providence, led by Providence, to organize politically. We now have the right to vote. And they put forth, eventually by 1866, after the Civil War, a new law that allowed full integration of all schools, regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. So what's important here is that these activities of these Africans, even though they're facing adversity, it seems daily, they come back to this place, this African Meeting House, their place of worship, they organize, and they use that organizational platform to build a better life and secure equal rights for themselves. And it's all happening right here in this neighborhood, right here in these sacred places. Next slide. And I just want to wrap up here because I want to keep it to 35 minutes or such. A lot of history, lots of history. We now have put together an inventory of collections. We have an inventory of some of the early 19th century pastors, and we're now starting to build biographies about who is who and who did what. J.H. Presley has a bit of a falling out, and he would go on to become the organizer of what becomes Only Street Baptist Church. That happens all the time. I mean, in Newport, the Union Congregational breaks away, and it's interesting. One of the things in New England is the earliest black or African congregations are either Baptist or Congregational, and then later AME. Those are the three important ones. But after the Civil War, you now have Southern blacks moving north for jobs and opportunities, and they're really Baptist. So you see a real growth of the Baptist faith, and the Congregational get kind of put to the side, almost go away, and the AME kind of hold their ground a bit. And then later, by the end of the 19th, early 20th century, you now have Cape Verdeans arriving who are more Catholic and are looking more in an Episcopal. Maybe AME, but Episcopal is as close as we'll get to Catholic. So what's fascinating about that is that, but in each and every case, they're creating their own places of worship, not because they want to be segregated, they want to be interdependent, because it's a safe place. It's a place where we can worship God freely. It's a place we can educate our children freely. It's a place where we can just sit and close the doors and talk about anything and not have a white oversight. It's a safe sanctuary. That's interdependence. That's what our ancestors were striving for. They didn't want to integrate. They wanted interdependence. They just wanted the simple rights to choose where they lived, where they worked, how they raised their children, and most importantly, where they worship. Interdependence, not integration. A very important and lesser known construct in the building of early African heritage America. And I just want to stop here because I know some of you know this, but this is something that's important because this African meeting house would later evolve into what is today the Congregational Street Baptist Church. This structure and Union Congregational structures were all built around the same times in the 1870s and 80s. These Gothic styles, you see it in Philadelphia, Baltimore. They're rebuilding. They're taking these old timber wooden meeting houses, and now they have standing and some money. And you see all during that Gilded Age a significant build out and building of these early founding black edifices, and you see that here. You also see whereas more people are moving into Providence, different viewpoints, younger guard disagrees with the older guards, they begin to spin off and they create their own denominations. But what's most important to recognize is that the heart and soul of early black churches in America, certainly the first free black church in Rhode Island, brings you back to the African Meeting House and Schoolhouse and Ebenezer Baptist Church. This is your place, this is your history, and the last slide please, and it's something that I hope you cherish, and I hope we have an opportunity for more people to be able to share this history, know this history, and most importantly, the final slide, so that young people can take this history as a sense of identity, a sense of power, and a sense of belonging, because today in 2021, if you are African heritage in Providence, you have as much right to live where you want to live, to work where you want to live, worship where you want to live, and be a part of the College Hill East Side community because your ancestors built it. So let me stop there. A lot of information. I got to take a sip of water and take a breath. But I'll certainly try to answer any questions you might have, and I'll leave an email so that if there's any follow-on questions or if you'd like to have access to a bibliography or research information, would love to share it because the more this is out in the community, the more the community will benefit. It's an old saying, when we can learn together, we'll learn to live together. So thank you for inviting me, and congratulations for who you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, but mine is not part of question. It's just like things that you have touched that resonated my thinking when I was young kid, because raised up from Africa, most of these things we do is telling stories. The elders will pass stories over to the young ones, then we continue passing stories. So when you say something about the Africans participated in slavery, which is true, because they were selling their brothers and sisters during that period. And even though as a young kid, we used to ask our elders why they are selling their own brother, because they said that the white man told them that they are going to a place that is better. that they will come back after they go. So not knowing that majority of them didn't even come back. And as a result, even though sometimes we raise, why not fight against the system? They say, okay, there are very few white people coming to the village. They will have killed all of them, but they have different way they treat to the chief during that time. So the chief are the one that has more power to tell the community what to do, because when they go to the chiefs, then they will give the chief whatever the chiefs want. And then the chiefs will come and go to different family and say, you, your son will go, you, your daughter will go. So they will just do all those things and force them to take their children out of their parents' house. That's exactly most of the things that happened because they were involved. Then from there, they were giving them some wine or this gin that they will bring to get them drunk and all those kind of things. Then they feel like they are drinking better drink. I think because I said most of the slavery, what happened here, not many people in Africa know. Even though when we read the history, we read the history what the British give to us. Very few, not in full detail, what our brothers and sisters are going through in America. So the Africans didn't know that until they decided to be sent here for education and other things. Then they start seeing what is going on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's an excellent summary of the best way to explain the success of the horrendous transatlantic slave trade over close to 3.5 centuries and 10 to 12 million Africans is that it was probably the world's first equal opportunity employer. Every religion, every race, every country participated, some more organized and some more efficient, such as the Portuguese and the Spanish, and later the English. But one of the things that we found with the Rhode Island landing in Ghana, today's Ghana, and particularly their dealings at Fort William and Ananabo, they specifically, as I called it, the black trade, would negotiate directly with Fanti coastal leaders, who were in turn, and I've had discussions with Fanti leaders and scholars about this, their general belief is that these were conquered Africans who allowed themselves to be conquered. They were less than. European colonization is very adept in, as a part of its colonization, is expanding tribalism. I mean, they've done it with the indigenous people in the founding and settlements of the Americas. They've done it certainly in Asia. They've done it in Central and South America, and they did it in Africa. So you had these small bands of white traders and merchants who would offer significant products and goods to these Fanti leaders, which would give them significant access to wealth and prosperity by simply turning over those that they had conquered, had been warring with anyway. Now, I don't want to be matter-of-fact about this because we're talking about human beings, but the reality is that by 1787, the Newport African Society is sending letters to Providence and Philadelphia saying, we've got to stop having our own people participate in this trade. And if we're finding our own people sailing on slave ships or participating in the transport of Africans to either the West Indies or to America, they cannot be members of our organization, and we need to isolate them and ostracize them. So there was a conscious understanding once those that arrived and survived here how horrible it is. But you're absolutely right. The European community was using Christianity as a tool to engage and encourage that better to live as a beast of the field enslaved in the Americas, but have access to Christianity and ultimately life everlasting under God through Christ, than to be in pagan, deep, darkest Africa as it was described. So you see the use of religion as a way to not only maintain the docile nature of slaves and put down rebellions, but it was also used as a way to negotiate the acquisition of enslaved Africans and transporting them from the old world to the new world.
And it's fascinating when you go back and read biographies of those Africans that survived the trade and returned to Africa, and now they bring a very different perspective. It's not nirvana. It's not what you think. They said this to us, they did this to us simply because they can control us. They can acquire us. I mean, let's be very clear. The buildings of the America is based upon indigenous people land and African people labor. If you take the land and labor out of the equation, America doesn't exist. South America doesn't exist. The West Indies as we know it today doesn't exist because it all existed through indigenous and African people. So you're absolutely right. It's a very organized, very insidious, and very powerful circumstance. We actually have cases in Newport. This was something I had to really wrestle with to look at secondary, primary information, because in Newport, we had all these Africans who said they were kings or queens of royalty when they were in Africa. It seemed like every African came from royalty, and that couldn't be the case. But what we did find, when we started to look at the records of the West Indies and back to Ghana, there are cases where, my wife's done much of this work, where young men and women of prominent Fanti families were actually being sent to England and to Rhode Island to learn the trade. And once they were sent, they were enslaved. And we have several cases of that. Bristol Yama, John Comino, Duchess Comino. We have several cases where John Comino is actually writing back to his family, back in Ananabo, and back to his uncle, and talking about, I am still alive, but I was slave, but now I'm free, and now I'm a privateer. So it's a very complex system. I mean, the human condition is complex, and that's why I have to remind people, you know, we need to be very careful if we're out there looking for the bad guy in the slave trade or in racism, because if you peel it back, we're all complicit to some level. Some just more organized, and some who benefit largely, but we're all complicit. John Brown and James DeWolf wouldn't exist if there weren't complicit Fanti leaders willing to work with their captains and their ships and allow them to succeed in transporting human property from West Africa to the West Indies to Rhode Island.
Yes, Keith, I want to thank you, because I've heard you speak many times, and I always learn something, and certainly you and your wife, Ray Rickman, Rowena Stewart, there's a lot of people. And for me, when I was in, they called them junior high schools then, the only thing we had in the history books was 2 paragraphs about Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves. And that was the extent of the black history that I got from the public schools. And how embarrassing it was for me. My mother's from Pawtucket, my father's from Fox Point, but my mother's family's from Virginia. My father was in the Navy. I was born in Virginia, but I was raised in Rhode Island. And when I got invited years ago in the 80s to the celebration about the first black regiment, how embarrassing it was for me living here most of my life, and I never knew about the first black regiment. And driving, going back and forth to Newport, went by it many times, and so I'm so thankful for all the people in the Newport NAACP that got that monument erected. But the thing for me is contributions have to be recognized, number one, by our children, so that they know that they're more than just the coming out of slavery. They have to know the contributions to society. And certainly for the white citizens, that they know that we've been contributing since the first black regiment, the 1700s. So the contributions on both ends are very, very, very important as we build a self-identity and self-worth in our children, because they need to know their history. And the other folks, they need to know about our contributions even before many of them came to these shores. But I just want to say that I thank you for all the work that you're doing with the, everything. And so welcome to Congress Street Baptist Church, because I certainly appreciate you. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you, Senator Metz. And I just want to convey that if you haven't heard, this past summer, Governor Dan McKee, and led by Representative Anastasia Williams, we now have a full African heritage curriculum for all K-12 schools in Rhode Island. Rhode Island will have the most comprehensive African heritage history program in the country. The smallest state will have the most innovative program. And what's cool about this is that it's African heritage. They will learn not only about African Americans in Rhode Island,
They'll learn about all the African heritage people across the diaspora, and Providence and Newport's and Bristol's connection with Barbados, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, back to Ghana, to Nigeria, to Senegal, and anyone and everyone that's a part of the diaspora will have that heritage shared and discovered. And I give full credit to Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. Rhode Island College will be doing the teacher professional training and development. Rhode Island Historical Society, State Heritage Preservation. This has taken us about 10 years. And this was the vision started by Rowena Stewart, Fred Williamson, Mike Van Leesten. If it wasn't for those three, I wouldn't be here today, and we wouldn't have this opportunity. So, you know, you're so right, Harold. No child of color, no child will never have what we grew up with is no information or partial information. They'll be learning this history much better than I can present it, and it'll be available to every student in every school very, very soon. So I mean, we're very excited about that.
I just have a quick question. Thank you so much for this. This is awesome. My question for you is, why were the pastoral tenures at the beginning of the life of Congdon Street so short? Because I'm noticing that with a lot of like 150 to 200-year-old churches, there's like 1 to 2 year tenures.
You know, it's a great question, and it's really tied to the larger organization. Many were not fully trained and educated pastors. So the challenge is that you had a lot of iterant people moving in and out of communities, but it didn't satisfy the full needs of the congregation, and they would move on. Many of them were also moving on simply because there were choices. I mean, literally between 1820 and 1850, that antebellum era, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of black congregations that are propping up everywhere. I mean, in Providence alone, by the Civil War, there's at least 5. There are 3 in Newport, and then later 5 by after the Civil War. In Philadelphia, there's 15. New York, there's 10. So you're seeing lots of transit activity going on, and this is going on in all congregations. This is not a black church issue. You see it going on in white congregations also. So in the case of the Congdon Street, the challenge also is the populations are changing rapidly. I mean, Harold himself is a traditional Rhode Island black story. You have ancestors that were growing up in Pawtucket, they could be Fox Point, they could be in Newport, and then they start moving for jobs and opportunities, and then later after the Civil War, people move from the South, and they intermarry, Cape Verdeans intermarry. Indigenous people, Wampanoags and Narragansetts, were intermarrying with Africans by the very first days. So as people start to diversify their culture, their ethnicity, their work, and their religion, so does worship start to diversify, and they are very transitory within that. But it's not tied to any one element of the church itself, or the congregation itself. I've never found that. In many cases also, they just don't like people. There's a lot of cases where you've got clergy saying, you didn't pay him enough, you promised to pay me this, you didn't pay me that, I'm going on to this next church. Or another one was not the person they thought they had, or the wives get mad. It's a lot of, when you read the actual records, it's really fun. Because, you know, you get, I was supposed to have this pew, and I didn't get this pew, and why? I mean, my own ancestors in Philadelphia and the church there, they're mad because they're paying for their pew. And then one day, somebody's sitting in their pew, and they're fighting over that. And why is that person sitting in the pew? I'm a pew payer, I'm a longer member than them, I've been in Philadelphia this time, these people just got here from Maryland. So it's really interesting to me when you stop thinking about and talking about the giants of history. I mean, not everyone is Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King. Most of us are like ourselves, and we have good days and bad days. And when you peel back the records, you really start to understand the dynamics of any one congregation or any one community. And to me, it's very interesting.
I did have 2 questions. So my first one is, last year, I think, Rhode Island removed the Providence plantations from the name, correct? What impact do you think that will have on the Rhode Island history as we talk about the curriculum that's going to be introduced now, and any thoughts on that impact?
That's a tough question. I can only speak for myself, so I'm not speaking on behalf of the 1696 Heritage Group of the Black Heritage Society. I was always ambivalent. I mean, Harold knows this. I was always ambivalent about removing the name, because my concern was if we remove the name, there's this expectation that somehow things are better for us as people of color. My also concern was if we remove the name, we're beginning to remove this real history that happened and had been perpetrated on indigenous and African heritage people. My concern, candidly, is I think there were lots of people who were willing to remove the name because they were cosmetic activists and they were riding the wave of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. But very few of them were going to the next level of, well, now how do we get the right history in place? How do we have more memorials and public spaces that recognize people that look like us or worship like us or speak like us? And I wasn't seeing that going on. That concerned me. It almost became that the solution was removing the name, and that should have been a starting point. And again, to be fair, this is going on all across America. I mean, my wife and I do a lot of work in Richmond, Virginia, so we're very adeptly aware of Monumental Avenue. We've lectured at the African Museum in Virginia. We're part of that, and we know that, but we say to them, once you take down the Robert E. Lee statue, what's next? Why are we not putting up more statues? Why are we not creating more history about the proud African heritage tradition of Richmond, Virginia? So my answer to that is that it's a starting point, but what are you going to do next? And that next step is more public memorials, more public education, more equity, so that more kids of color and more people of color have free choice of where they want to live, where they want to work and worship in Providence, Rhode Island. I can give you a long list of things that we need to focus on after taking the plantation name. So anyone that thinks that that was an end point, they're wrong. It's a starting point.
Thank you. Before I ask my second question, just want to see if there's anything else from the audience yet. Okay. So in front of you, Mr. Stokes, is the original, I believe, the seal from Congdon Street that Deacon Price found for us. So this monument, and it'll be here at the church for those, but this is the Congdon Street seal. It is heavy. And the seal says, Congdon Street Baptist Church, organized December 8th, 1840. And it's one of the seals, you know, like a notary seal. Can you speak to the role of this seal, the importance? Is this unique to Congdon Street or other churches that were established at the time? Any info on that?
It's not unique for that time. Having seals were a very important way for providing information for letters, any types of transmission of information, of property, of collections and things. So seals were a very standard form. So it's not ununique to other institutions. The fact that you still have something that's from 1840 is unique and special and sacred and should be properly preserved. One of the things that we're doing with the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, as I said earlier in the presentation, we have 2,600 cubic feet of collections dating back to the 18th century, and then coming forward to the 20th century. And one of the challenges that we've had is that those collections were scattered over 3 warehouses in Providence and Pawtucket, and some not properly temperature controlled and properly protected. Now the Society is working very closely with Rhode Island College in developing a comprehensive curatorial assessment, cataloging, and eventually presentation and preservation of these artifacts. Because there are many, many Congdon Street artifacts. There are many, many Ebenezer. There are many, many Only Street. There are many, many Shore Memorial, Union Congregational, Mount Olivet. I mean, across the state, we have significant collections that are part of your history that once we can catalog and properly preserve and eventually digitize, we want to share back to the whole community, because we're so excited about what we have and what few other states have at this level of depth, but it's only been through the leadership of the Black Heritage Society today and support by so many private and public members that we're able to sort through this and present this information. It's literally been scattered. I actually go through minute books and records of many of these early black churches of Rhode Island, and it's just interesting to me because the names pop out and go, wow, that's so-and-so. That's who they are. And then you find them bouncing between congregations based on moving to different parts of Providence, or someone taking their pew and they go to another church. But all that information is there for us, and it's all anchored on artifacts and documents. And the work ahead going forward is to sort it, preserve it, and make it available to the general public.
Excellent. Thank you. Any final questions?
Good morning. Thank you very much. You mentioned the education and making us inclusive in the history and the education in the school system. I know not you specifically, but it's going to happen. How recent will they come up? Will they come up as far as like the 20th century? Would be my question, because Martin Luther King Jr. visited here twice in the 60s, and other significant events have happened here in Rhode Island. But sometimes you teach the kids 1600, 1700, but do we go as far as this century?
That's a great question, thank you. I did have a hand in designing the platform of what will become the curriculum units of instruction. And I can absolutely tell you that it will begin with the first unit of instruction, Africa before European colonization, and it will take you into the 20th, into the early 21st century. It absolutely will, because again, kudos to the Black Heritage Society, we got a lot of stuff. We got a lot of information. And you know, I just want to close with this. Here in Rhode Island, we really occupy some really special places. There are very few places in this country, in the diaspora, where we have original locations, original documents that we take for granted. I mean, I'm not saying you do, but to have this special place like this, to be able to worship in this place and be a part of something that is so historic, that's not something that others really have the opportunity to do in other parts of the country, or either other parts of the Northeast, but we have it here. So we're very excited that once we start to properly organize and protect these documents and these artifacts, we will come up with new technologies that will present this to the larger public, from online forums to virtual forums. I don't want to get ahead of the Black Heritage Society because they've got some neat things they'll be announcing in the near future, but I think people will be very excited how we use very modern communication platforms to get this information and get these stories out so that more and more people will eventually want to come back and invest in Black communities, be part of Black parishes, and support young Black children going forward. So again, thank you for this opportunity. Hopefully we'll come back in a year or so and have even more information, but again, I can't tell you what an honor it is to be here and share this information with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stokes. And on behalf of Congdon Street, we have a little gift for you. And we appreciate you coming by and giving us this information. And we look forward to seeing you again.